Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partner with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their own community. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Socially Democratic is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you passionate about providing access to justice? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an associate to join their employment and industrial law team on a full-time, permanent basis. You will use your legal technical knowledge and expertise to strive for fair outcomes for Maurice Blackburn's clients. The role is based in Melbourne, Victoria, and to apply, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Be part of change and fight for fair. Apply now. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive campaigns and issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we're going back overseas. We're going stateside today to talk to Lawerence Ben, who is a former Australian trade union organiser, but is now based in the United States, in New York City, and he's the national political coordinator for the Retail, Wholesale and Department Store Union in the States. And he's going to talk to us a bit about the Amazon campaign that union just recently ran and unfortunately lost. But there's some length in that tale. I think that story will continue to unfold with some news coming to light in the last couple of days. But Lawerence is on the show today to talk about that campaign that the union undertook in one of the Amazon warehouses in Alabama in the South. So look forward to that conversation with Lawerence today. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, then let us know by leaving us a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And for all of the updates about recent episodes, don't forget to follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Thursday morning in Melbourne. And in March, April, earlier this year, Amazon workers in Alabama voted against unionising. It was a campaign led by the Retail, Wholesale and Department Store Union, or the RWDSU. And that campaign faced some serious resistance, including union-busting tactics and intimidation of workers who were going to vote from Amazon management. And today on the show, we're joined by Lawerence Ben, who's a former Australian trade union organiser, but now is based in New York City and is the national political coordinator for that union, the RWDSU. I'm sure that after 2 or 3 weeks of working there, that acronym will simply roll off the tongue. To talk to us about that campaign, Lawerence, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Stephen, thanks for having me.
How quickly did it take for you to remember the name of the union that you work for and that acronym?
I mean, it's one of the great things about the union movement, isn't it? We love our acronyms, and then when they're not hard enough, we throw in a hyphen and chuck in a couple of other letters. So, but that definitely is one that still chokes up a lot of people who have even known the union for a long time. So I think I got it after a couple of years.
And union amalgamations just even overcomplicate what is already a complicated process in trying to work out the name of a union. I've long advocated for the trade union movement should just rebrand itself as the union. So all of and they're never going to do this because there's no way you get 30 or 40 national secretaries to agree to this, but just amalgamate and become one big union and call it the union.
Right. For the sake of avoiding that problem, it might be worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
All of those meetings where people get it wrong.
The last time we saw each other was in a bar in Manhattan on a freezing cold November night. The Dunn Street US engagement mission had just come to a successful conclusion. The very last event was actually at your union offices in Midtown. And we were having a drink and sort of celebrating and thanking you for your participation and your secretary's participation in the program. And I think we're talking about, as we sort of wrapped up, I said, well, I'll see you next year because we'll do it again. 4 months later, we have a global pandemic sweeping across the world, and that
who would have known?
I know how much our lives have changed. Obviously, you're an Aussie living in New York. What's been your experience of being in New York, particularly at the height of the pandemic?
Yeah, it was. Not just as an Australian, just as someone who lived here, it was pretty surreal. I still remember very vividly the day that the city shut down. I'd been in Australia in February for my brother's wedding, and people were kind of talking about this virus and figuring out what was going on with it. And then I got back to the US, and I was at work one day, and people were starting to freak out more and more about it. And then I think it was the day that the NBA said we're closing down, and that's when it made it real. And I remember at about noon that day, my boss just said to me, go home. I was meant to go to a meeting somewhere, and they said, no, just go home. The whole place is going to shut down. And I remember I went into my boss's office. He said, we're shutting down and we're going to go into a recession. And I went home, and I didn't go back to the office. And I've been working from home, for about 18 months. That's kind of weird, but walking around the city in the kind of dark depths of the lockdown, when it was really kind of scary in terms of the death and infection rate, was just, totally surreal. One day we jumped on a bike and rode around the city, and, riding down the middle of Fifth Avenue with no one around was kind of like a ghost movie or something. It was something else. But the city's picking up, and it's, light at the end of the tunnel, and it's recovered and recovering. So, things are on the up, but when it was all happening, it was kind of surreal.
A couple of things there to pick up on. One, riding down the Fifth Avenue and it's completely deserted would be a scene from the opening scene of Vanilla Sky, that Tom Cruise film. I don't know if you've ever seen that before, when they actually had to shut down Fifth Avenue for a morning shoot, and he comes out and gets in his hotted up Porsche or whatever it is and drives down the middle of Fifth Avenue. There's no one there. It's kind of like, what's going on? You actually lived that. That's insane. The second thing is you're a man after my own heart, because the listeners have heard me tell this story 10,000 times, because during the early parts of COVID, I'd have guests on and say, my first question was, when did you think it was serious? When did you realize that this was actually something that was going to impact our lives? And everyone had always really good answers at sort of, when the epidemiologist started to tell us this or that or the next thing. You're the only other person who's answered the same version of it, which is mine, is that it was when the NBA cancelled their season.
Right.
I'm glad you take your social and medical cues from elite sports athletes. That's good.
Well, not just me, the entire US population. When you know that the people at the NBA and Broadway who don't mind making a buck decide to close down, their arenas, that it's real. So I think that made it pretty real for everyone as well, bizarrely enough.
Now, give us some background on the union that you work for in the US. Who do they organise, and why did you go over there to start working for the RWDSU? There
we go. You got it right. Firstly, I came over in 2018, just before the midterms, halfway through the Trump administration's first and only term. And I come over to do a labour studies program that turned into a master's, and was put up with the RWDSU, and it was in the political department. It was a really interesting time, flat out working on the midterms. You had a New York gubernatorial election. You had the statewide election where the Dems took back control of the state Senate, which was a big deal. So all of that was going on, and then I kind of stuck around and sort of haven't left, and have become captive to the never-ending political cycle, as well as COVID. That's sort of how I ended up over here, and the RWDSU is a really interesting storied union. The name is slightly deceiving because we represent and organise workers in industries far more diverse in our name. So you'll find, our members in the big old department stores, Macy's, where the Herald Square store alone has a few thousand members, Bloomingdale's, supermarkets, H&M. But then, we represent a lot of workers in the South, which is quite rare. Union density is obviously quite low in a lot of the southern states, and we have a lot of density in poultry plants in places like Georgia and Alabama. We represent workers in cereal manufacturing in the Midwest, in the biggest bakery in America, in West Virginia. Really all throughout about 25 different states in a really disparate array of industries. I can jump into the history a little bit, but I think our union has a really interesting organising history, because for those US labour historians out there, we were a CIO union that, was bred out of a stronger organising tradition when they broke away from the AFL and then merged back in. So we sort of came out of that tradition, which makes us, really fascinating. I think some of that strong organising culture still carries on today, and something that we, heavily focus on.
Before we turn our attention to the Amazon campaign itself, for our non-United States listeners who may be not so familiar with the industrial framework in the US, perhaps give us a bit of an overview of the sort of the industrial laws and regulations that guide employee-employer relations and how unions are able to represent and collectively bargain workers, so we can get a sense of how you're going to approach and why you ran this particular campaign in Amazon.
Yeah, it's a good point, because I think it does inform the way that we think about it in Australia a little bit differently. In the US, I think, first of all, union density in the US has been on a constant downward trend. Australia is not dissimilar. I know union density in Australia is slightly higher than the US. In America, union density hovers around 10%. In the private sector, it's about 6%. And similar to Australia, it's high density in the public sector in the US that keeps union density just above 10% in the US. And then really from state to state, density can change dramatically. So in New York State, where I'm based, union density is above 20%. And in New York City, it's even higher. New York City really is well and truly a union town. And in states like New York, they differ from other states called right-to-work states, and I'll get into that a little bit, but you'll often find that density is a lot lower in right-to-work states. And they differ based on state-by-state laws. But generally, the industrial laws in the US are based around the National Labor Relations Act, which is a federal law, and that governs organising campaigns like the Amazon campaign. I'll get into it. I guess we'll get into in a little bit. But really, that law that came in the 1930s as part of the New Deal was amended around a decade after it came into play and has not really been amended significantly since. And organising in the US, as you can sort of tell by union density, is really, really, really damn tough. You have to win a recognition election, which means that you need to get 50% plus one of workers at a work site to vote yes for the union. Fair enough, but and I can go into some more detail later, it's just a process that is exploited to no end by employers through a really highly sophisticated union-busting industry that employers spend millions and millions, in fact, billions of dollars, have spent billions of dollars on to try and, crush ordinary people who are trying to collectively get together and negotiate better wages and conditions. So it's mainly around this broken federal statute, and there's a big push in the US to try and change it at the moment with a federal bill called the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organise Act, and that would really address a lot of these issues that make organising so tough in America. But to go back to your original question, if I had to sort of characterise one feature in America, it really is that their workplace laws are so broken and make organising so damn tough for ordinary people who just want to improve their wages and conditions.
I'll have some questions later in the show about that PRO Act, so don't let me let you leave without asking questions about where we're going with that, because I am actually interested in learning about that. But let's turn our attention to the Amazon campaign to start with, and describe the historical relationship that existed between the company Amazon, which I think is the second largest private sector company behind Walmart in the US, and trade unions in general. The company's been around since like 95, 96. What's that relationship been like over the years?
Well, I think firstly, as you pointed out, Amazon is huge. I think you're right; it's just behind Walmart, but the projections show within a handful of years it's going to be bigger than Walmart. I think they've got around 1.3 million workers across the globe. In the US, they have around 500 warehouses and facilities. During the pandemic alone, Amazon did very, very well. They added, I think, 500,000 employees just during the pandemic. Their profits skyrocketed, and they're a behemoth. And I think to, demonstrate it, I mean, really in New York City in particular, they're just all pervasive. I mean, I can't walk out my front door on a daily basis without seeing Amazon. Delivery people everywhere. You get, rented delivery trucks just parking in a lane of traffic with a bunch of workers and a couple of traffic cones, just with a sort of like impromptu distribution center in a busy lane of traffic, and, delivery workers running around streets and Amazon boxes, being delivered left, right, and center. You've got, Amazon fulfillment centers popping up in neighborhoods, clogging up traffic and annoying local residents. And then you've got, the workers who make all of this run, and to put it crudely, really get, chewed up and spat out by this employer that really its business model is to not have people have long-term careers. And its business model injures people. The serious injury rate at Amazon is double competitors like Walmart. Serious injuries meaning people who either can't go back to their regular duties or can't go back to work at all. And this is all part of their business model, that speed is everything. And, workers are way down the priority list, and ordinary workers who want to do something about it by collectively getting together and organising a union get crushed. They face, some of the stiffest anti-union behaviour and union-busting tactics really ever seen. That's why I think the recent campaign in Alabama was such a big deal, because getting to an election at all was unprecedented. It had never happened in the United States before, simply getting to the point of having a ballot. But along the way, there have been unions throughout the United States, throughout Europe, throughout Australia, throughout the world that have faced these same tactics from a company that, creates a lot of workplace issues as part of its structure. And then it's part of its business model to vehemently oppose workers who try and get together and organise a union to do something about it. So it's not an easy task.
Tell me a bit about the workers that you are trying to organise. You've touched on some of the experiences that they have working for this huge multinational company. Are they primarily casual workers? Are they part-time, full-time? Is job security a big issue on top of the conditions of employment?
Yeah, it's a good question to dig into, because I think it helps understand the rebuttals to Amazon's argument. Because Amazon will say, well, what's the problem? We pay people $15 minimum wage when, the legal minimum nationally in the US is $7.25. What's the problem? We give people, pension and healthcare benefits, and they are directly employed. They're not, labor hire workers, although Amazon does do that in Australia, but I'm talking about the US. But I think where the problem lies is that the way that the work functions is fundamentally precarious and insecure. So the sustainability of the picking rates that workers are expected to do are just unbelievable. Expected to pick hundreds of items per hour, and you're held accountable to your own picking rate. And if you don't meet that rate a couple of times, you can be written up. And often if you get 3 write-ups, you're fired. And there's no unfair dismissal, so you're fired often at random. Sometimes people say, well, I was written up 6 times, but that person got fired after once. Or there's no grievance procedures. They also have a thing called time off task, which can be ruthless and unpredictable, where basically if you stop to have a drink, a drink of water because it's damn hot in the warehouse and you've been packing at this ridiculous rate, you can be written up for time off task. If you want to, stop and have a chat to a manager about the problem, you can be written up for time off task. If you want to go to the bathroom, you can be written up for time off task. So you're constantly being surveilled. You're constantly under these pressures. You're constantly, being held accountable to unrealistic standards. And as I said before, people are getting injured. The serious injury rate at Amazon warehouses is double that of its nearest competitors, people like Walmart, who, as we know, are not brilliant employees themselves. So the injury rate, the turnover at Amazon facilities nationally is estimated to be about 100% annually. We know that from the Amazon warehouse we were organising in Alabama, but we know Amazon warehouses nationally have around 100% turnover. And that's because of injury rates. It's because of unsustainable workloads. And that's, arguably part of their business model. And I'd just say one other thing about the wages. Amazon brag about the $15 minimum wage. And when we had a congressional delegation come and visit down in Alabama, they had a couple of workers walk out and hold up a banner saying, Congress, why don't you do something and pass the $15 minimum wage, even though the 5 members of Congress there voted for it. But there is a nuance to that, because $15 is not the prevailing wage in the warehousing industry. In fact, in Alabama, in the warehousing industry, the prevailing wage is closer to $20, if not higher. In fact, for some warehouses, union warehouses, much higher than that. So that's a bit of a disingenuous argument in and of itself, because in the warehousing industry, which Amazon is a part of, although conveniently sometimes they argue they're not, depending on what they're trying to prove, that wage ain't so good. And that's what you'll hear workers say as well. So, when you add up all of these sorts of issues, you've got one of the biggest, and shortly to become the biggest private sector employer, running around, frankly, treating workers like crap. And workers are trying to do something about that.
Why did the union pick this warehouse in Alabama, of all places? Why did you decide to set your sights on this particular warehouse when there's obviously Amazon warehouses right across the country?
It's a good question. I think it goes back to the original discussion we're having around the nature of labor laws in the US. And in some ways, from my observations as an Australian, sort of looking at things upside down with the different legal system, often in the US, I feel as if the site picks the union. The union doesn't always just look at the map and points and picks the site. And I think, during the pandemic, there were workers who felt there were significant health and safety issues. We know that Amazon weren't addressing workers' concerns around sanitizing work sites, around being transparent about workers who were getting sick, in addition to the list of issues I just went through, as well as, workers just being fed up with the way they were being treated. And the workers who were in the situation came to the union saying, we need help. And it was a worker-driven effort with the union's support to try and make it happen, to try and bring about the change they were looking for, to have some sort of voice in their workplace, to be treated with dignity. And that's the other thing I'd add as well is, a lot of these things I'm going through and listing are, industrial issues of a legal nature or industrial conditions and standards. But there is also something to be said about workers saying, I'm just not treated with dignity and respect. I haven't got a voice in the workplace, and it's become a slogan, but workers saying, real workers out there will say, I feel like I'm being treated like a robot. And there's some truth to that. So, ordinary workers came together in Alabama and said they wanted to change this, and they're incredibly brave people, coming together publicly often to try and bring about that change, because there ain't no unfair dismissal laws or general protection laws in the same way in the US. And for these, workers to come together, as someone said, it was ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And in some ways, those workers were, the reason why it came to be in Alabama, of all places.
So what was the strategic goal of the campaign when you've sat down with those workers in that particular warehouse and the union sort of started to plan out your approach? When did the campaign begin, and exactly what did the mountaintop look like for you guys?
Well, going back to once again, the legal structure in the US, which really informs the way that all of this works. In November last year, the union filed a petition with the Labor Board to say they wanted an election. And in the US, before you can have an election, so have that ballot, and where you try and get 50% plus one workers to vote yes for the union, at that petition, you need to get what they call sufficient show of interest. So you generally need around 30% plus of workers to have signed cards with the union that you petition to the Labor Board to say, yeah, we've got, sufficient interest here to have a ballot. So that was filed in November, and there was a lot of organising activity leading up to that November petition. And then following the petition, Amazon took various legal measures to dispute that. The NLRB, wasn't interested in those arguments. And then finally they ordered for a voting period to begin on February 8th that went for 7 weeks. But just going back a step, that organising leading up to November 20, it's pretty tough in the US. There's no right of entry laws. So in Australia, union organisers have a legal right to enter the workplace and talk with workers, in the lunchroom, which is not an easy thing alone. It's not a silver bullet. But in the US, you haven't got that. So you've got to meet workers off site. You've got to be out the front of the car park trying to talk to workers. It was pretty difficult in the middle of a pandemic to try and do some of those things. But that brought about some innovation. But it also brought about a lot of challenges. And then, those pretty dedicated union organisers down there, which included some rank and file shop stewards, were at that gate 24/7 in rain, hail and shine, making sure that workers who came and went at, all hours of the day and night for their shifts saw that the union would have their back 24/7 as they entered and left the facility. And it involved, talking to workers as they stopped at the stoplights, leaving the car park to get them to sign the union cards. And that eventually led to Amazon going to the local county to ask them to change the stoplight timing to try and, break down our one moment to speak to workers, just in case it wasn't hard enough. But to put it all in perspective, to get to that point of having a ballot, as I said at the beginning, is unprecedented, had not happened in the US before. And, there's something to be said about the union organisers and rank and file members down there that made that happen.
So you've got your strategic goal. The goal is to get this 50% plus one ballot up. Notwithstanding, my second question after this will be, what were the tactics that the management deployed to place constraints upon what you're trying to achieve? We'll get to that in a moment. But what was, I'm interested in getting a sense of what your strategy was first and foremost to achieve this strategic goal. What opportunities did it present? You actually just touched on a little bit before about COVID, so you had to create some innovation there. Talk us through about how you'd go about developing tactics that enable you to achieve this goal.
So one of the few good things about US labour law is that when you do successfully petition, you get access to a list of workers and some contact details, and that enables you to communicate with them through text message and email. And I think watching our team, they did a good job at pioneering, member-to-member and peer-to-peer text messaging, a serious phone banking operation. We're talking about trying to contact around 6,000 workers here, like not an insignificant bargaining unit. And, a whole range of things from, a media strategy to a political strategy and trying to pressure Amazon, with sign-on letters from Congress, through, speeches in various legislatures, pressure through pension strategies and other things. I mean, a lot of this came later on once, we got closer to the voting period. But it really is, a sort of 360 strategy to communicate directly with the workers, as well as build that community pressure on Amazon. And I think one of the things that's really hard is, organising in the US from what I've come to see is that having relationships, strong relationships with workers is important. Because what you're asking them to do is going to be a pretty brave thing for them to do. You can lose your job, you can be fired on a whim for doing this sort of stuff, and therefore, building a strong relationship and having strong worker leaders to see the thing through is really important. I think at a work site with 6,000 people, it's a huge challenge. And then you add the turnover that I've mentioned, and then you add COVID. So, there's some of the challenges you're facing, but I think having that 360 strategy of trying to speak to people through phone banking and peer-to-peer texting and all the other communication methods, as well as that community pressure on Amazon, was kind of the drumbeat we were going for.
Now let's talk about the tactics that the company deployed. We hear this term union busting, and I remember when I was a young union organiser, and I think we had someone from the SEIU come over to Australia at a conference and talk about union busting. It's just, when I first heard that term, I was horrified. It's such an aggressive kind of, term to use, and it feels like, oh my God, there's an evil out there ready to undo the good work. I think of unions and what we try to achieve, and I guess I was a bit naive then at the time as well. But talk us through about the resources that a company the size of Amazon deploy to put constraints on what you are trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think I'd say this about union busting is. Amazon is in Australia as well, and they deploy these tactics. And the phrase union busting might not be, widely used in Australia, but the concepts are happening in Australia, and Amazon, as well as other companies, are using them. But I think for lack of a better term, art form of union busting definitely developed in the United States in a big way. And as I said earlier, has become a really highly sophisticated industry. I think the industry prefers the, the more diplomatic union avoidance. But, it's union busting. And the tactics are relentless. The money that Amazon spends on this sort of stuff is huge. We saw one number that it was upwards of $10,000 a day on various union busting consultants. And if we're talking about a campaign from, earlier than November right through to now and into the future, you can do the math on that. So I think it's a big challenge because the laws are stacked up against you. So I'll give you one example where leading up to that voting period starting on February 8th, Amazon at the Bessemer, Alabama facility was hosting 18 hours a day of what are called captive audience meetings. And they did that, I think, for about 6 weeks straight. So you've got workers that come through these quote unquote classes, and they do these classes back to back, 18 hours a day, where they basically just force propaganda upon workers in a captive audience setting where you're in a room and you have to listen to this on your work time, which I find ironic for a company that's obsessed with time off task, but they're willing to drag workers multiple times into these rooms to attend these quote unquote classes. And this is all legal to do this. And, when you try and get home to get away from this stuff, you're getting perhaps multiple text messages a day from Amazon. You're getting mail at home from Amazon. You go into the bathroom stall at work and you see on the back of the door propaganda from Amazon. And, within all of these tactics is really clever communication that alludes to certain things. There are rules and restrictions on, a company outright saying certain things like, you're all going to be fired. But, there are clever ways that of alluding to things that Amazon adopted, using language like everything's on the table. You might get some things, but you'll also lose some things. And, alluding to workers through, the press and other things that, facilities could be closed and other sorts of consequences that, really frighten workers who are facing this enormous power imbalance. So, add all of that up and it becomes a pretty tough thing to come up against, particularly when it's, just about the biggest company in the world and the laws are stacked up against you.
So how did the union combat that? Like, how did you? Because you talked about phone banks and relationship building through your delegate structure or your shop stewards. How did you seek to try and combat this this offensive approach from Amazon on this stuff?
Well, I think it goes back to some of the earlier points I was making of having our own 360 strategy of trying our best to do our own communications, be it through mail, through text message, through phone calls, through meetings. But, I think when the employer has access to FaceTime for 18 hours a day for 6 weeks, it's as you know, as an organizer, Stephen, FaceTime door knocking is everything. We know that's always going to be more effective than a phone call. So that is a big challenge. But I think, our own campaign, as well as the public pressure to really put a spotlight on this company, to try and point out to, the US and the world that what these guys were doing, trying to crush ordinary people coming together to improve their wages and conditions, was wrong. You had the President of the United States come out and call them out, saying that this should be a free and fair election and companies shouldn't be able to coerce people. I don't think a US president had come out that way in the middle of the union election since FDR. A big deal. A guy who said that he was going to be a president for workers and unions, and he was good in his word in calling out these companies and highlighting that they're doing the wrong thing. So I think Biden coming out, I think other people like Stacey Abrams, I think trying to connect with workers by then sharing these stories back onto them to say that there are people out there who have got your back. You're not alone. What you're doing is a really brave, important thing, and there are other people out there watching you to support you through it.
Are there, in that 360-degree campaign, outside of the constituency that is the workforce, working in that particular warehouse, were there other ways in which you sought to leverage the resources of allies and supporters, maybe it be political, maybe it be in other aspects of business or local government, that you could put pressure on the company? Talk to us about that part of the strategy.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, some of the US unions that you'd heard from in the past. And I think one of the things that US unions do really well that is innovative is, when you're up against this sort of opposition from a company, unions over here have become pretty innovative at trying to come up with ways to respond to that. And I think some of the interesting things over here that unions do is to try and build a strategy around pressure from pension funds that are invested in companies like Amazon to call them out. So I believe the New York City and New York State pension funds put out statements. You had members of Congress, I think around 50 members of Congress, sign letters to call out Amazon, as well as more than half a dozen US senators do the same. You had, celebrities from, the Baseball Players Association, I believe, and others who put out their own messages of support. And then locally, you have faith leaders. There were community days of action where you had activists on the ground come and volunteer to, door knock around the neighborhood and ask people if they'd be willing to put up signs in their yard or in their businesses to support the workers and let them know that, this is a full community support effort. So, I think really trying to build it out as a community campaign, and particularly a local community campaign is something important. And also for workers to hear from trusted voices that, they're supported through this and they're doing the right thing.
Going into the final weeks of the campaign itself, when the ballot was live, workers are now going and voting, talking to sort of people not as close to it as you are, so that's why I'm going to ask this question. I got a sense that because, one, the union had managed to get the ballot initiative up in the first place was seen as a huge win, and you've said that yourself, that there was a reasonably good feeling about the campaign that, oh shit, we're a chance here. Like, this is a real possibility. And I don't know I don't know if I read this or if someone told me, but certainly your own reporting of those workers that you had organised, if you looked at the numbers sheet, it looked good. Like, it looked like that the union was within a very good, there was a possibility that you were going to win this and get the 50% plus one. But then obviously things changed, and what I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the company expanded the franchise of eligible voters to a new group of workers that you had not even spoken to yet. Is that true? Two, talk me through that. What was going on when you were strategizing, when you learned of this? That would have just been an absolute, pardon my French, but a head fuck, because I would have been furious at that.
Well, I mean, this is another tactic, right? So the voting period started in February, but as I said earlier, the petition was in November. And around that point, when you're organising, you're generally trying to figure out what universe you're working with, so you can, figure out the math of, when do we have 30% or 50% or 70%. So therefore, knowing, the number of workers who are employed there is important. But this is a classic tactic from companies, right? That once they get a sniff that people are organising, they will seek to, go on a hiring spree to inflate their workforce. So all of a sudden, you might be dealing with double the number of workers you need to organise than you'd thought a few weeks earlier. And I think there's that definitely happened here as well, although Amazon might say that, it was around Christmas, so we had, casual hires or whatever. But that's a tactic you come up with, that you come up against in the US a lot as well. And, that was a factor where the number that came out was around 5,800. And it, showed to us that there definitely had been a big hiring spree and became a big factor for us. But, in addition to that, it's the turnover as well. 100% turnover within 12 months, you've just got a whole new workforce, which, even along the way, you might start a campaign, before November, and then, by February, you're a quarter of the way into the year, and, a quarter of the workforce might have already gone, and you're starting from scratch with a whole bunch of workers. So that makes it tough. But I think, definitely getting to February then when the voting started, so it's a 7-week voting period and it's a mail-in ballot. And that voting period is pretty long. It's probably about double what you're used to having. And then, having a mail-in ballot is a different kettle of fish as well. And I think, during that voting period, when it starts on, February 8th, you've got workers who have just been in these back-to-back captive audience meetings. And Amazon have, just saturated them with all this FaceTime. So, I think one of the things we found, and I know organisers would say that, talking to workers, they came across workers who said, I wish I could have changed my vote, which you can't do under Labour law in the US. You can't, change your vote once you've cast your ballot. And I think there's a sense that, once, we really hit our strides, Amazon had, come off the back of the captive audience meetings and there were workers who wanted to change their votes. But, it was too late for some of them, or for quite a few of them. So I think that was a factor that people mentioned as well.
So what was the final result in the end?
So the final result was there was 53% turnout, and then you had 1,798 no ballots, and you had 738 yes ballots, and then you had 505 votes that were challenged, and those ballots were never opened, and we won't know which way they went. But generally, it was 2-1 Amazon's way. They got 1,700. We got about 730.
Then you guys, obviously, the union challenged the way that the elections were run. And obviously there's been some new news come out of the National Labour Relations Board just recently. Tell us about that.
So, as I sort of mentioned, Amazon launched one of the most intense anti-union campaigns seen in the US. It made, major national and international headlines and put a spotlight on this behavior. And, I can go through a few of the other things they did. One of the big ones was they directly lobbied the United States Postal Service to have a postal box installed on company property. And, that was a big factor in the objections that we filed with the Labour Board. We filed 23 objections to the way that Amazon behaved, to basically say that, they poisoned the atmosphere and it wasn't a fair election. And as you said a couple of days ago, the hearing officer from the Labour Board came back with a recommendation that said that, Amazon did impede what's meant to be called, I think, the fair laboratory, and I think they recommended, that there be a second election. And the ballot box is a huge factor because a huge part of Amazon's communication was to send text messages and communicate with workers saying, send in your ballot in this ballot box that's in the car park right out by the front doors. Amazon has hundreds, if not thousands, of cameras all throughout its facility, as well as dozens in its car parks. So there's automatically this feeling from workers that they're being surveilled. And then there's also this feeling from workers about, well, hang on, who's in control of the election here? Can they access my ballots? What else are they surveilling, whether I voted or not, how I voted? Really taking away this sense that it's an objective process. And it also came to light through, I think, Freedom of Information requests that, Amazon were hardcore lobbying the United States Postal Service, asking for this box to be installed, to really push them to meet any deadlines to get this thing put in their car park. And then it became a huge part of their strategy to, try and push workers to vote there. They put up a tent over the mailbox that had, propaganda around it as well. And that really gave workers a sense that they were being watched and that, who was in control of this thing. And the Labor Board ultimately, in its recent recommendation, found that was a significant factor that, infringed upon the fairness of the election.
So with the potential of a do-over in this ballot, reflecting and doing evaluations on the campaign that you just run, what are the key lessons for you guys in terms of where you can make adjustments to ensure that you do get a result if there is the possibility of having a rerun of the election?
Yeah, so I think, it should also be said that recommendation came from the Labor Board. There is some way to go yet with the legal process. Like any legal process, it's convoluted and drawn out. And employers, are very savvy at trying to use that to their advantage. So there is a little way to go yet with that process. But I think, from listening to organisers and others involved on the ground, it goes back to the earlier point, which I think, you would say yourself, Stephen, as an experienced organiser, is you just can't beat FaceTime. You really can't beat, speaking face-to-face with workers and building relationships. And I think, COVID definitely hurt our ability to be able to do that. But, the experience really reinforced that lesson. And I think, that's really one of the big lessons here as well. And I think one of the other really interesting comments I heard from one of the organisers as well was just connecting with young people. It was really interesting listening to younger workers who didn't know too much about unions and the generational difference that, required extra levels of education around what workers had done for people throughout different generations, what they continue to do, what they're all about. And, it's been interesting to sort of hear those lessons as well that I think is, food for thought for folks about, how they can connect better with younger people.
I read a lot of articles about similar campaigns that have been run against Amazon in parts of Europe and obviously here in Australia, the SDA and the TWU, my two former alma maters of, or alumni, I should say, as my industrial organising career began, running concerted campaigns against Amazon here in Australia. They are a global company and continue to expand across various regions. Surely there must be some sort of global approach that needs to be taken here from trade unions. So not just the work that you're doing in the United States and in particular in a place like Alabama, but then broadly speaking across the globe. What kind of approach is being taken from unions at a global level to connect with each other about how they approach tackling Amazon? Because I'm sure that there will be different challenges from different industrial jurisdictions, but there would be commonalities as well in terms of how to organise in these warehouses.
Totally. And I think, information sharing is a big one, right? Like it's almost uncanny how similar Amazon's tactics and, the way they view work is throughout the world. And I recently testified before the Senate hearing on job security, and hearing Amazon's own testimony and responses to questions from folks like Senator Sheldon and others made that pretty clear. I mean, Amazon has a horrible workplace record. The injury rates, the insecurity of work, their huge reliance on labour hire in Australian warehouses, and the way they treat, flex drivers and others is terrible. And they're one of the most anti-union companies in the world. That was seen in Alabama. It's also being seen in Australia. You hear the TWU going to a warehouse to speak with workers and organise, and the cops are up front. And similar thing, in Alabama, the cops are in the car park, and workers are thinking, well, what's going on here? It's another sort of psychological, play. And the commonality of those sorts of tactics and sharing information around what those tactics look like, and, other innovative ways to try and address them, I think is something that is important and is happening internationally, through global union federations and other places. I think the other lesson for Australia really is that, I remember when I first started organising, and folks are trying to learn from America, that everyone's talking about Walmart, how big Walmart is, how terrible Walmart is. And now it's Amazon, except the difference is that, Amazon's on Australia's shores, like they're here. And this company trying to import this US style of highly precarious work, and their attitude towards unions is wrong. And, you and I have both spent time organising in warehouses. Some of the guys in union warehouses in Australia have incredible conditions. They've got good middle-class lives. They can send their kids to the schools they want to send them to. They might own a holiday shack. They can go on an international holiday. Fantastic. In the US, for Amazon workers, those things are inconceivable. They are a dream for a lot of workers. They're just not beyond reach. In fact, they'd look at their job at Amazon, that's not even a long-term career, that'd last a couple of years. But, we know folks in warehouses in Australia work there for decades and have awesome careers. And companies like Amazon trying to come in to Australia and import this insecure form of work and crush unions who try and do something about it is wrong. And I think anyone involved in policy or industrial law in Australia should, really be on their toes about trying to address that, because I think often companies like Amazon will try and say, this is innovation, the future of work, we're bringing in jobs. Well, what kind of jobs and what kind of jobs are they going to take away from those, good union jobs I'm talking about in other warehouses? So, there's a lot to be learned.
It truly is a David versus Goliath battle that you guys are embarking on, both in the United States and I guess trade unions across the globe. But as I say that, I now think about one of my favourite books about organising, written by a hero of mine, Marshall Gantz. It's titled "Sometimes Goliath, Sometimes David Wins," and I truly hope for you guys that this story isn't finished, and that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and there is some hope for those workers both in Alabama and across the United States. So I think that we will have you back on the show soon with some more positive news as this unfolds, and you actually eventually have a win, and David does get the victory over
David
Goliath.
Wins.
Yeah, indeed. Lawerence Ben, thank you very much for your time today. And we wish you the best of luck, both with your career in New York, and enjoy that experience, but also helping workers organise in the United States. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.